There comes a point when the body enters survival mode, even while life keeps moving. Breathing shortens. The sacrum loses its base. The lower abdomen stays in constant containment. Energy is present, but it is spent sustaining basic functioning, not creating. Effort becomes continuous, and presence begins to thin out. This state emerges when the internal axis loses coherence. With the axis misaligned, vital potency loses direction and turns into urgency. The three-movement adjustment works precisely on this deviation. It reorganizes the support triangle that determines whether energy sustains defense or creation. As the axis reassembles, the organism begins to exit survival mode without tension, and the force once used just to maintain itself starts seeking another destination. This shift away from urgency does not happen in isolation, because the body learns through repetition and rhythm, not through single events. That is why, at certain moments, it is worth remembering that there are practical deepening processes based on this same principle, such as healing in motion, 22 somatic cycles to release trauma, restore flow, and return to creation, mentioned in the first pinned comment as a possible continuation for those who recognize that the axis reorganizes over time through the body, not through mental understanding. As the process repeats, reorganization stops being comfortable because the body begins to move out of the exclusive command of the adrenals. Continuity demands more staying power, and a specific resistance emerges linked to the loss of urgency as the organizing axis. This resistance shows up as the urge to stop, speed up, change focus, or finish before the time is right. It is the system trying to reclaim a familiar rhythm. The return to the old pattern happens because adrenal discharge is still familiar and offers an immediate sense of control, even at the cost of vital energy. At this point, the first movement becomes more important: conscious sacral tilting. It no longer serves only to find base, but to sustain base under internal pressure. The sacrum must keep offering support without locking, even when urgency tries to take over again. The gesture is small but continuous, allowing the structure to hold time without resorting to tension. Here, the body learns that it is possible to remain organized without accelerating, and that base does not depend on rigidity. The second movement, linked to the indirect release of adrenal load, begins to be refined. This is not about discharging stress, but about reducing the command of haste that still tries to dominate. Prolonged exhalation, gentle touch, and conscious slowing allow the adrenals to lose authority without being fought. The body recognizes that it does not need constant alertness to remain stable. This adjustment reduces the swing between alert and containment, opening space for another kind of energetic organization. With urgency less dominant, the third movement starts to integrate, the gentle activation of the gonadal axis. Here, potency is not excitation or discharge, but continuity. The gonads begin to sustain available energy without anxiety, offering traction to the system. This movement restores direction to vital force, allowing it to accumulate without spilling over. The body learns to hold potency without haste, something that was impossible while the adrenals were setting the pace.
When resistance appears, the adjustment happens through staying with these three movements combined. The sacrum continues to sustain base. The adrenals keep losing command. The gonads maintain available potency. Small oscillations are tolerated without immediate correction. Support is built through continuity, not control. By not giving in to urgency or forcing progress, energy stops circulating only between alert and containment and begins to organize itself as directional force. The signs of crossing through show up as greater tolerance for time and less need for confirmation. Restlessness loses strength because the axis no longer depends on the adrenals to stay upright. Internal movement becomes more economical and energy remains stable without swinging between advance and retreat. There is a greater capacity to remain organized under expansion. This indicates that the support triangle, sacrum, adrenals, and gonads, has begun to operate as a single system, preparing the body to sustain creation without constant effort. At this stage, the body is no longer trying to exit survival mode. It has already exited, because command is no longer held by the adrenals. The change shows up in how energy begins to organize itself in daily life. The sacrum sustains base without rigidity, offering real ground for movement and decision. The gonads return to participating in direction, restoring continuity to vital potency. The system starts operating from the axis without reacting to every stimulus as a threat. This exit does not happen as a single event, but as a new pattern that begins to repeat. The body recognizes that it can sustain more life without entering alert. Excessive readiness loses its function. The internal feeling is one of greater coherence between base, rhythm, and potency. The axis becomes a quiet reference, present even when attention is elsewhere. Survival stops being the constant backdrop of experience. At this point, creation no longer depends on the mind because energy is no longer consumed by alert and containment. Adrenal expenditure decreases consistently, and vital force begins to accumulate in a stable way in the lower center. There is less dispersion between impulse and action because the body tolerates staying. Decisions begin to hold over time. Creating no longer requires constant pushing because potency finds rest before it moves. This stability allows energy to be directed with greater precision. The body no longer needs to spend force just to stay organized. Action arises from a deeper place, with less interference from haste or anticipation. The axis sustains both silence and movement. Creation begins to happen as natural continuity, not as concentrated effort or momentary bursts. The final gesture works on refining this axis. It is minimal because the sacrum already offers base, the adrenals no longer apply pressure, and the gonads already sustain continuity. Attention rests in the lower center, allowing energy to settle without being pulled upward or discharged through urgency. The movement consolidates what is already active. Breathing follows naturally without anticipation or control. At this level, perceptions appear as signs of functional stability. There may be firm density in the base, steady warmth in the pelvic region, longer breathing, and a more regular internal rhythm. The impulse to act loses its rush while keeping force available. Energy remains concentrated and directional. The body stops leaking potency to sustain defense because the axis is intact and reliable. With this reorganization, the relationship with time changes in a concrete way. Projects are no longer abandoned because expansion no longer collapses the system. Choices stop oscillating because the body sustains continuity. Creation holds because the axis tolerates growth without triggering urgency. Vital force finds stable direction and can move through longer cycles without dissipating. When the practice completes, there is no sense of closure, only steady readiness. The sacrum continues to sustain, the adrenals remain modulated, and the gonads keep potency available. The stages were crossed as a real reorganization of the support triangle. What remains is a body capable of sustaining creation over time without automatically returning to survival mode. What was crossed here leaves a specific physical marker: more real weight in the sacrum, less haste commanded by the adrenals, and greater continuity sustained by the gonads. Breathing tends to drop on its own, and the lower abdomen supports without contracting. The body signals coherence through internal quiet and reduced effort to stay organized. This is not an abstract sensation. It is a concrete shift in how the base responds to the weight of life.
To anchor this state, use a simple, repeatable gesture. Press the sacrum with the palm of the hand for 3 slow exhalations, allowing the weight to settle. Or release a short, low sound at the end of the breath, without any intention to release anything. This gesture does not create a new state. It simply reactivates the axis that has already organized itself, reminding the body where the center is when attention drifts. This state needs to work in the middle of life, while walking, working, deciding. Integration happens when the sacrum keeps its base, the adrenals do not take back command, and the gonads sustain potency, while reality demands action. The difference becomes measurable: less energy spent just to endure, more energy available to direct. The world does not change. What changes is how the organism responds without returning to urgency. This understanding is not new. Bruce McEwen, when studying the biological cost of stress, captured it precisely by stating that the body pays a high price when it is forced to live in a state of constant adaptation. When survival no longer commands, that cost decreases. The axis begins to sustain continuity, and vital energy stops being drained by invisible defensive adjustments. When the old pattern tries to return, continuous effort, directionless haste, the feeling that everything depends on you holding it together, return to the beginning. It will not always be necessary to move through everything. On some days, adjusting the base is enough. On others, sustaining the middle of the process is sufficient. The body now carries a map of the support triangle. It recognizes the way back because it has already walked it through real experience. If this work touched something true, write the mantra phrase below in the comments to anchor the axis through bodily decision. I exit survival mode, and now my axis sustains creation. Liking, subscribing, and following the next contents helps maintain this rhythm over time. When the triangle remains aligned, energy stops being spent just to endure and begins to sustain what needs to continue.